Hey, it's Brett, and this is Brett and Some Books, and we are continuing the Progressive Plantation by Lorenzo Kom'boa Ervin. And this first section in this video is It's Hell for POC to Work at Peace and Justice Centers. In June 2006, I took a job in Nashville, Tennessee, to become an administrative coordinator for the Nashville Peace and Justice Center. It's one of a number of pacifist movements sprouting up around the country that bring together a number of social change, liberal, and radical movements. Until I took the job in Nashville, I had no first-hand contact with such movements and was unaware of their histories as sellout, racist, and poverty pimp organizations. I was soon to learn, however. First, I was hired on the false pretext that a large part of what I was going to be doing, besides running the organization, was anti-racist training for the membership body and members of the board of directors. However, almost as soon as I arrived, I found out that this organization was irretrievably a white racist entity and that I had no power to change anything. In fact, the reason I was hired was because no one locally in the black community wanted the job. They were hip to the history of the MPJC and were repulsed by its racism. One other reason I was hired as the first administrative coordinator of color was because there was an apparent split of the white board of directors who had tried some feeble attempts at anti-racist reforming the organization and, failing that, at least pushed for the hiring of a person of color. Being put in the middle of a split between the whites caused me to catch hell, and then I tried to enlist the few peoples of color for support. The board called that racial agitation and tried to fire me. I had been there less than 2 months, and one of these factions tried to run me off. The so-called good white people who had voted to hire me and the open racist who wanted me fired held a personnel hearing, and found that there was no grounds for me to be fired. But I was continually the object of harassment by these white people who used every occasion to strike at me. At one board of directors hearing, the same white woman who had brought the original motion to fire me turned around and grabbed papers out of my hands and threw them into the trash. I was shocked and embittered, but I knew this was an attempt to intimidate me or provoke me to retaliate. The next day, I filed a formal employee grievance against this board member, called Auntie Jane by many of the group members. As soon as I filed this employee grievance, almost all of the board members claimed that I had made the entire incident up, that Jane would not do such a thing, and that the entire group was not capable of racism. They demanded that I apologize to her. Failing that, they also made my work at the MPJC as hostile and demeaning as possible, and then claimed that I was not carrying my duties, and I was adopting a hostile attitude toward the board. I was continually being told that I would be fired if I did not drop the employee grievance charge. The hypocrisy of this is that even though they screwed over myself and other employees, they continually chirped and organized around Jobs for Justice, run by the AFL-CIO. There was to be no justice for those that worked for them, however. Eventually, this woman, Auntie Jane, and some of her allies made another motion for firing, and eventually a bogus hearing was held where the evidence of insubordination and failure to perform my duties was produced. This evidence was a secret letter to the board by a white woman who had been a predecessor in the job and was enraged that she had to give up the position for me. She submitted a scurrilous false statement claiming that I told her that I did not want the job, that I had no computer skills and I was not qualified for the position, and other false statements. This had been submitted shortly after I arrived, but I was never told of its existence. She was a racist and did not like black people at all. She made that abundantly clear. She was never called to testify at the so-called termination hearing, and I was never served with a copy of the letter before or during the hearing. I was just summarily fired. What all this brought forcibly home to me is how corrupt, hypocritical, and racist this movement was. The truth is that pacifists and leftists make the worst kinds of racists because they posture as anti racist and friends of black people. This woman, Jane, even hypocritically sneered that she used to support the Black Panther Party back in the 1960s, which meant absolutely nothing to me. But this is a reflection of how they truly believe that they are pacifist radicals, that they cannot practice or harbor racism in their movements. It is the worst form of self deception. They have swallowed the illusion that their consciousness as white social justice activists around a white middle class agenda is liberating for all. They do not accept that they themselves are racist and have merely replicated the same social oppressions inside their movements that the larger society does, and that the only difference is our degree and form. Progressives make the worst kinds of racist because they want you to believe that every vile racist act they perform is a good service by good white people. Well, with friends like these, who needs enemies? They uphold racism, middle class reactionary politics, and exist on the corporate grant money that, like the parasites they are. I did not realize at the time how many of these pacifist, peace, and justice centers there were. It seems that every state has one. They all have the same kind of politics and approach, and encapsulate pacifist views of radicalism. They are also infested with the same kind of internal racism. It is literally hell for peoples of color to work at such institutions, along with other white social justice nonprofit groups. They are literally enemies of the people, a do-gooder front to carry out liberal left-wing politics for the governments and corporations. They are paid handsomely by capitalist social change foundations, with rich people's money, the scraps they give up to keep the restless natives under control. And house slaves of the left, since the progressive movements do not, or the progressive groups do not really unite with the various liberation struggles of people of color, they must give the illusion of sympathy. Thus, they hire black or brown faces and have them posture as a full member of the group and to act as their representative in the black community. Thus, they hire black or brown faces and have them posture as a full member of the group to speak up when they are attacked over their duplicity and racism. During chattel slavery, the white plantation owner had a privileged class of house Negroes who did the master's bidding at every turn and united with the master to such a degree that they protected him from the other slaves, the field Negroes, and saw themselves as part of the master's household. In return, they got better clothing, food, and housing, and more privileges than the common field slaves. After a time, they did not even believe that they were slaves, but rather a butler or manservant to this rich white man who exploited black labor, misery, and suffering for profit, but treated them fine. The master referred to them as owls N-words, even to their faces. Now, on the progressive plantation, this same kind of racist dynamic is in play. These progressive groups hire black and other peoples of color to use them as a foil against the black POC communities they are hired as administrators or spokespersons for a majority white organization, and are to protect the master's interest at all times, even if it conflicts with his or her own community's best interest. These people have no power within the organization and are expected to be a complete puppet just for sake of a paycheck or for recognition from white people. Many settle for that. I refuse to be one who did. It needs to also be recognized that the radical socialist and anarchist movements have the same kinds of figures of color who perform the same role. They are slaves on the white radical plantation and have no voice and tolerate all kinds of abuse just to be part of the movement. It is an unhealthy, oppressive relationship which reflects white domination of the movement. It is an example of ideological imperialism, the practice of which must be recognized and smashed within the left. But what is ideological imperialism? We are talking about imperialism, a system of social, economic, political, and economic domination by an external power elite. Could be another nation state. In this instance, a class of upper class white people organized into an activist movement, using their superior financial, economic, and movement resources to dominate the entire social movement. And this type of replication of oppression is a fundamental part of the establishment of the progressive plantation. It is absolutely essential that white progressive and radical activists become aware of these places and the kinds of evils perpetrated within. There needs to be a struggle to either transform these places or shut them down. We need to empower these POC within these places to fight these races and to not passively accept internal racism as the norm. Class snobbery, or why right radicals are afraid of white working people. Anarchists do not believe in revolutions by a Leninist party of revolutionary elite intellectuals guiding and then ruling over the downtrodden masses. We believe that it is the people who will make the revolution, not the so-called leaders. Yes, white anarchists must work with peoples of color, but they must be active in their own communities as well, if they will build the diverse movement we all desire. We must challenge and educate against racism and undermine fascist ideology in white communities. One of the most egregious failings of any white activists is their fear and willingness to organize in white working class communities. So many want to come down and organize in communities of color. For years, I've tried to get anarchists to do community-based organizing in white working class communities. I tried to establish the anti-authoritarian network of community organizers some years ago and had worked with the various active resistance organization meetings held between 1996 and 2000, but these were abject failures. The anarchists simply don't get it. If we don't reach out to ordinary folks instead of déclasse punks with red mohawks, we will forever be trapped in our current class as a milieu instead of a movement. Some of this reticence to organize in white working class communities is because they themselves come from privileged upper middle class families and have gone to elite universities and feel estranged not only from the political establishment, but from daily social existence experienced by poor and working people as well. Thus, they engage in a revolutionary posturing of speaking for poor people. It is really the same nonsense I have seen for years, though these white radicals thank you, Little Leon, for your help. Okay. Thus they engage in revolutionary posturing of speaking for poor people. It really is the same nonsense that I have seen for years, though these white radicals may give lip service to fighting for workers' rights and even advocating for the poor. They really are extremely alienated and fearful of working and poor class people, even if they are white. But it is not just these cultural and class differences which frighten them. They also know that going into white working class areas and talking about racism, brutality, or human rights for blacks and peoples of color could get them ostracized as N-word lovers and perhaps physically attacked by bigots. There is much racism in the white working class itself. But this type of hard, dirty work has to be done. no matter how unpopular or dangerous, if we are to deal with the effects of racism and fascist indoctrination in white communities. Thus, we have to be part of the people. We must understand no revolutionary force will arise from the white working population if they are not empowered and re-educated. They must not only be challenged on their racism, but raised up as a political force to fight, then educated to stand with black, brown, and other non-white peoples to overthrow the system of oppression. Speaking honestly, while it is still a white-dominated movement, anarchists and socialists must live and organize among poor people and working-class folks in white communities if we are to make a social revolution even halfway real. While I am not against them living in communities of color individually, white anarchists are not needed to lead or organize black peoples of color in their neighborhoods, and yet they cannot remain with white dropout youth exclusively in their political work. In fact, the days are numbered of anarchism and progressive groups as a subcultural white milieu, excluding workers, seniors, non-whites, the poor, and other grassroots groups. We must move forward as diverse force for millions fighting for a new world, not to be stuck in a stage of isolated white middle-class idealists. The anarchist and progressive movements, still too white, middle-class, and self-absorbed. For many years, I've criticized the contemporary anarchist movement for being too Eurocentric and focused on white youth culture. I repeat those earlier criticisms, which have hardly been welcomed, but never refuted, and then now point out the entire progressive social justice movements and radical tendencies suffer from the same internal racism. When confronted, some have outright acknowledged the truth of those criticisms, and while even a few supported them to make changes within various segments of the anarchist and radical movements, most have been defensive or outright hostile to the charges. Some have counterattacked. I have been accused of many misdeeds by various white anarchist and radical movements, while raising the matter of a lack of diversity and disempowerment of POC in the movement. The countercharges, including that I am making blanket false charges of racism against white anarchists and progressives, of wrecking organizations if I see racist practices inside them, and other complaints which now have made me an outcast among some. I have even had whispers behind my back that I am somehow hard on white people because I challenge their racism. I believe that all this is hypocritical and makes a lie of the core ideals of anarchism and socialism. It just gives ideological cover to white domination and exploitation of the movement. This is our movement, damn it, and you anarchist socialists of color cannot change it. Well, I am sorry, but this is exactly what we intend to do. We intend to make it serve our needs, to make it fit our cultural, political, economic circumstances, and conform to our histories of struggle. I have been saying for years that peoples of color coming into the anarchist and other white radical movements will change it, just as European immigrants who brought a variant of it to America in the mid-late 1800s onward to the 20th century practiced it based on their ethnicity and social customs as Russian Jews, Italians, Poles, Germans, and other European peoples. So why the hostility toward Chicanos, Africans in America, Arabs, and others from the Third World when they try to build a new anarchist or radical movement? Well, as they apparently see it, we threaten the hegemony of white radicals to continue anarchism of socialism in its social form. As it stands, the white radicals currently define and organize the movement. The reality is that as long as it is white-dominated, it will only reflect a Eurocentric worldview of a privileged class instead of the position of those of us on the bottom of the social ladder. Oh, they give lip service of so-called universality of the anarchist socialist ideal, anti-racism, the support of liberation struggles of oppressed peoples in Mexico, and the Euro-Asian Roma ethnic group. And they give tactical support for Troy Davis or Mumia Abu-Jamal, but none of their real efforts are to maintain white supremacy, but all of their white efforts are to maintain white supremacy in the anarchist or socialist movements. No one else can come along and revise the theory. True, most white activists are more ignorant than evil when it comes to issues of race and class, but in their defensiveness and hostility, they tell people of color that they are just not truly welcome in the anarchist movement unless they are under white control. In other words, POC must be willing to be objectified, that is, to become a mindless house N-word of the left, willing to smile, parrot the views of the white leaders, and keep their mouths shut. Shamefully, there are even so-called political Wiggers who have co-opted black or Indian, Chicano, Asian culture styles and who work at seemingly more visibly black or authentic seeming than the people of color in the group itself. I'm thinking of particular persons in mind here. Of course, it's all an act, a charade to give white radicals entire leadership and authority over such movements. This charade occurs throughout the white left and has always made myself and other persons of color feel very uncomfortable. One thing I do not understand is why white people call themselves anarchists or radicals, think that somehow they have suddenly transcended racism and workings of this capitalist system just because they joined such groups. They are race traitors, anarchists or anti-racist, so they could not possibly be racist, or so they think. White left-wing political movements are as guilty of racism as any other kind of social organization in a racist society. They must be made aware of this, and they should understand part of a progressive's role is to try to empower peoples of color in the anarchist or radical movement when we come into the movement, rather than retard our development. They should do the exact opposite of what whites in society do on the job, in civil organizations, or in the professions, rather than engage in racial discrimination themselves. I am not implying all white radicals are inherently racist, part of some evil biological species, nor that I have seen racism among every anarchist or radical tendency. Rather, what I am saying is that I have seen many left-wing activists who are ultimately conditioned with the same racist social values as many whites in America. So to merely declare that one is a race traitor or is a member of an anti-racist group is not nearly meaningful enough to claim an exception from the entire history of white supremacy. This is merely a form of self-delusion. Honesty is one of the best qualities of a true anti-racist organizer, not posturing. The white anarchists must be willing to join the inevitable movement of peoples of color for freedom and liberation, rather than just denouncing it as politically incorrect. Of course, I am firstly talking about people of color sympathetic to anarchism who have formed autonomous movements. It has been my experience that such groups have been isolated or neglected by the anarchists themselves. Then, usually because of a lack of material aid and political support, they have withered away and died. Roots of Resistance in Vancouver, the Black Autonomy Movement, Colors of Resistance, and many others that I know of, which have briefly surfaced over the years and then died away because of isolation, lack of material aid, lack of political support, and ridicule by the general anarchist movement. This is disgraceful and does not speak well for anarchism at all. These groups are on their own, isolated and vilified. The anarchist movement, which is overwhelmingly white, must start to understand that they need to do propaganda work among the black and other oppressed communities to spread anarchist ideals, and they need to make it possible for non-white anarchists to organize in their communities by providing them with technical resources, printing of zines, video and audio cassette production, organizer training, and assisting them with financial resources to get on their feet. Whatever happened to mutual aid, or is that just reserved for white radicals? But just to show you how much resistance there is, even for a semi-autonomous group of anarchist POC, I had written I had submitted written proposals a few years ago for the creation of a black people of color organizing group within the Industrial Workers of the World, the Love and Rage Revolutionary Anarchist Federation, and other anarchist groups to try to bring in people of color, as I was the only black person at the time in the entire IWW organization. But this proposal was repulsed with shrill cries of separatism, nationalism, and even racial disruption by some of the really backward white anarchists in those groups. Then they attempted to characterize me as some kook, making up false charges of racism and stirring up trouble. So I know firsthand that while many white anarchists may talk a good game about class unity and racial justice, they ensure that everything is under white control and either discourage people of color from joining or only allow the token voice of a stray person of color within these groups to be heard, and then very softly. They do not want to be challenged or deal forthrightly with matters of race and class. In fact, another incident a few years ago, when the Industrial Workers of the World, the so-called Radical Anarchist Labor Union, held their annual General Assembly in North Philadelphia, an overwhelmingly impoverished black and Latino inner-city neighborhood, an incident occurred which fully illustrates what I mean. All that day, they had closed the doors to the community and held their meeting just for the predominantly white members. Then the lights suddenly died, and they had to go outside and conduct the remainder of the meeting on a small lot on the side of the building. This also happened to be behind a low-income apartment complex, and predictably, when these white people were so loudly engaged in one of their inane arguments, residents of that apartment complex came out to see what was going on. When they approached and asked, "Who are you people? What are you doing out here?" one of the anarchists replied, "We've got a right to be here. Lorenzo, tell them we're all right." At the mention of my name, I looked at them like, "What do you mean, we, white man?" If they had kicked their butts, it would have been fine by me. I came into the neighborhood. The arrogance of such a reply. What right did 50 weird-looking white people have to come into a neighborhood where they did not live and conduct their meeting? If I took 50 black people for a meeting in a white neighborhood and did the same, the white folks there would no doubt have called the cops and had us arrested. This racist ignorance of white radicals just shows us how racial exclusion works in the anarchist movement. They never tried to involve neighborhood residents in the event before it occurred, and even when challenged by these folks in their own neighborhood, they never invited them to take a seat and become part of the assembly, maybe even signed some up for membership. They did not want them, and as I later saw it, they clearly did not want me either. I quit right after that. It was the final straw. I had been doing nothing but fighting racism and the so-called one big union ever since I had been a member anyway. I have seen years of such racial exclusion, which has made me realize that, although these things are beginning to change in the anarchist movement, it is not the result of white anarchists finding enlightenment. Change is happening because anarchist people of color are beginning to organize their own email lists on the internet, are starting their own political collectives, and even planning for a founding conference of an autonomous Peoples of Color Federation, a continental network to help organize all these autonomous people of color, APOC, in the U.S. and Canada into some potent political tendency. They are realizing what I finally realized years ago. Only if we are strong and organized will we get any respect. They may not succeed, but they are willing to try and refuse to accept a white-dominated movement which demeans them and does not even speak their existence. The very discussion of this POC, of this APOC movement, raises new possibilities for autonomous work in communities of color and makes anarchists of color realize just how neglected our own communities have been, and that we need to make a special effort to reach our own peoples. But this does not mean that anarchists of color will or should refuse to work with whites on issues of mutual concern, but that they should definitely never do stoop work for white radicals. That is recurring for other POC, for white anarchist radical organizations carrying out their program instead of our own and covering up for their organizational weaknesses. They don't deserve it, and the real issue here is creating an autonomous POC tendency that dealing with all white groups from a position of strength, independence, and mutual respect, which only autonomy can provide. We can no longer put up with any sort of racist garbage, which is the overwhelming white anarchist movement, or let them posture as being inherently anti-racist. So, in response to those who want to know, there is racism in the anarchist movement, all right. It's just cloaked as ideological nonconformance. But the issues, as I see it, is not to waste time arguing with white anarchists and their racism. No, we need to build unity among ourselves first and then demand our rightful place in the anarchist and social movements. And for more, please follow so you can see the updates and further chapters.